G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Institute, and today we're bringing you more guests from our webinar series, specifically from our webinar Unpacking the Federal Budget. On Tuesday, the 6th of October, Treasurer Josh Frydenberg delivered a delayed federal budget with a debt of $1 trillion. That's the same Treasurer who a year ago boasted he would be delivering a budget surplus this year. My, how things can change.
In 2020, Australians have been tested like never before. Flood, fires, drought, and a global pandemic. COVID-19 has resulted in the most severe global economic crisis since the Great Depression.
The global pandemic has triggered a global recession, and the number one goal of this federal budget is, or should be, to create jobs and reduce the unemployment rate. But if that's the goal, there are sure some pretty odd and some very poor choices in the budget measures. This budget features massive tax breaks and incentives for business. Income tax cuts are being brought forward. There's infrastructure spending and much more to get into.
One of the most important federal budgets in history.
A blowout budget for a bummer of a year.
Instead of a surplus, the Treasurer has tonight delivered Australia's biggest deficit in decades.
The federal budget was record-breaking on many fronts with eye-watering debt, immense spending and extensive jobs plans.
Plan to spend Australia out of the COVID-19 recession.
Spending and debt levels not seen since the post-war era, all aimed at generating jobs and driving.
To spend big to try and pull our economy out of its worst recession in almost a century.
Australia's biggest ever deficit and tax cuts for most workers.
Tax cuts rushed forward, tax breaks for business, manufacturing grants, there's those apprentice subsidies.
The biggest beneficiaries from that are workers on $120,000.
Not for all, but for many businesses, the great bulk of businesses, this is like all their Christmases have come at once.
Beyond belief, really, that we've got the billions going on tax cuts with a question mark, will they be, of value, when we could have done something really serious to protect people, children, millions, to keep them out of poverty.
It's not a great story for older workers.
3.5 million Australians come off JobKeeper at the end of March. Will there be enough jobs to pick up those people who will desperately be needing them at that point? That will be the test of this budget.
And it needs to be transparent and make sure that it gets hands into the pockets of working people, because it's working people's spending that'll make the difference.
And to unpack those budget details, I was delighted to speak to Senior Economist at the Australia Institute, Matt Grudnoff, and Senior Economist at the Australia Institute Centre for Future Work, Alison Pennington. And just a warning that there's a few mild swear words in the discussion. This was recorded live on Wednesday, the 7th of October 2020, and things may have changed since recording. Thank you so much, Matt and Alison, for joining us today. First to you, Matt, what's your overall assessment of this budget?
Well, I mean, it's Economist Christmas, and the only good thing about a delayed budget is it's only 7 months to the next budget. So, but look, budgets, as I always say, are about choices. And this year, the government chose to talk about jobs, but it hasn't actually done a great deal to create jobs. In fact, what they've done instead is hand out billions and billions of dollars, mainly to high income earners in the form of tax cuts, and even more, tens of billions of dollars to business for investment at a time when many businesses are worried about staying open. And we know that this is a very ineffective way of stimulating the economy. Also, the assumptions behind this budget are incredibly rosy. I'll give you an example. Next financial year, the government is assuming that the real increase in GDP is close to 5%. So we're going to have a growth rate of almost 5%. To put that in context, the long-term average growth rate is about 3.2%. And in the 7 years this government has been in power, it has never reached the average. It's always been below average. So next year we're going to have almost 5%, and they've never reached the average in the 7 years we've had, and we have a recession on. What I'd just say about the budget is it lacks imagination and it's a wasted opportunity. After the Great Depression, Sydney built the Opera House. During the GFC, school facilities were upgraded. What are we going to have after this recession? What lasting benefits are going to be around? Well, it looks like almost nothing. We could have had a new energy system that decarbonises. We could have set up aged care. We could have set up healthcare. We could have set up social housing for decades to come, but we're not actually going to get any of those things. So really, it's not that everything in this budget is bad. The government is spending literally hundreds of millions of dollars, but it's a real wasted opportunity, and it just shows the lack of vision. The government seems more interested in just handing out money to people who are worried and who might save it or might not invest it, than actually getting in, doing the hard work, working out what we should have more of, and what we're going to want more of in the next decades to come. And they just haven't done that work, and what we have is a missed opportunity.
And Alison, what's your take on the budget overall?
Yeah, as Matt was outlining all of the missed opportunities, it's interesting that Frydenberg opened his speech last night saying this is the most important budget since World War II. But actually, if you look at all the budgets that came out in the post-war reconstruction period, they were all investing in the types of ambitious public-led investments that Matt's outlined. And instead, what we have is, being very unfiltered here. It's billions of dollars into rolling the dice of a business-led recovery. And it's clear in the lead up to this crisis that all the same problems we had of low business investment, essentially business on capital strike, none of what the government has put on the table in this budget is actually going to ensure we have the right investment and the jobs.
There is no economic recovery without a jobs recovery. There is no budget recovery without a jobs recovery. And this budget is all about jobs.
That was the other branding of this budget. As we came into it, government said this is a jobs budget. And in particular, they said this was going to be a game changer for women who have been disproportionately impacted by the crisis, and for youth who have been locked out of decent work, pretty much since the GFC. And for a jobs budget, the biggest supposed job creation program they brought forward is a wage subsidy to cover 450,000 young people that are unemployed, and it very much resembles a work for the dole scheme, and it expires after 12 months and basically ensures that there'll be just a churn of people through particularly low wage, low skill, crappy jobs. So that's the signposter of the jobs program. And that's pretty much ensuring that whatever comes out of this budget is going to be more insecure jobs, no career trajectory for people, no long-term security. And in particular, women have been totally shafted after, trumpeting this idea that there was going to be a reintroduction of women's economic security analysis or statement. 240 million to lift women's workforce participation, and it's really tokenistic spending in leadership programs and less than 300 entrepreneurial ventures for women. So it's going to fall real short of getting women back into work. It's clear that we needed childcare support to get that to happen, and legitimate jobs. So I would say it's insufficient spending. The tax cuts aren't going to work. They're not going to create masses of consumer spending to support new jobs. If we take that into account with the existing cuts of billions of dollars to JobKeeper and JobSeeker, then it's pretty much guaranteed that we're looking at long-term entrenched unemployment as a feature of the Australian economy for years to come, which is a bleak opener. But maybe we can push it to what things can be done as well to change that picture.
Yeah, as with so many things in 2020, bleak does seem to be the theme. But Matt, I'll come back to you. Obviously, I kind of talked about the $1 trillion debt figure, but give us some of the big picture, numbers for this budget on debt, deficit, and kind of like a snapshot of the big levers that are at play in this budget?
Yeah, so the deficit this year is going to be just over 200 billion. The deficit next year is going to be just over 100 billion. And the deficits, if you add them together over the next 4 years, are just shy of $500 billion. So they're massive. They're huge numbers. And I think probably one of the best things that this budget has actually done is it has slayed the myth that debt and deficit is a problem. It clearly isn't. It wasn't during the GFC when the Labor Party did it. It isn't now when the coalition are doing it. Hopefully we don't have to endure more sort of silly scaremongering around debt and deficit. It's not a problem. We can pay it back if we choose to, and it will not be an issue. But some of the big ticket items, probably the biggest item is actually a number of tax write-offs that business can do. And that's probably worth in excess of $30 billion over the next 4 years. And essentially that's asking businesses, many of whom, as I said, were worried about keeping the door open, to invest in new stuff. And if that works, then it does create some employment. The problem is that a lot of businesses, if you're worried about, whether or not you're going to make payroll, whether or not you've got enough customers to meet the demand you have now, are not going to be rushing out to buy new stuff. They won't have the money to rush out and buy new stuff, but writing it off in tax, and I suppose also writing off in tax assumes that you have to pay tax. And so a lot of these, the bulk of these tax write-offs, assume that you actually have tax to pay that you can write off.
Under our changes, more than 7 million Australians received tax relief of $2,000 or more this year. These expanded tax cuts are part of a major structural reform to our tax system that will see around 95% of taxpayers face a marginal tax rate of no more than 30 cents on the dollar in 24-25. Under the coalition, taxes will always be lower.
The other big ticket item is the income tax cuts. That's just under 20 billion, about $18 billion over the next couple of years. And that mostly goes to high income earners. So they're bringing forward stage 2. Now, stage 2, if you don't remember, basically helps people, most of whom earn more than $120,000 a year. To put it in context with you, that income distribution, about 90% of the benefit of stage 2 goes to the top 20% of taxpayers. The bottom half of taxpayers get about 4%. So half of all Australians at the bottom get 4%. The top 20% get 90% of that tax cut. That's next financial year. This financial year, they've extended the Lamito and stage 2, and it is a bit better as far as the income distribution goes. But again, the problem with these tax cuts is that the low and middle income earners will get most of it at the end of the financial year when they've put in their tax return. The high income earners, who are far more likely to save it, are getting it every fortnight in their pay packet.
So just to repeat that, because those numbers I'm sure will be shocking to a lot of people, can you just repeat those numbers about where the bulk of the benefit goes from bringing these tax cuts forward?
Yeah, so bringing forward stage 2, basically 90% of it goes to the top 20% of taxpayers, of income earners. And the bottom half get about 4%. In fact, I think something like 96% goes to the top 30%. So basically nothing outside of the top 30%, 4% outside of the top 30%.
And what you're talking about there, that's like a permanent decrease in the amount of tax that they'll be paying. Yep. But for the lower and middle income earners, they only get that benefit for this financial year.
Yeah, exactly right. So they'll get the Lamito, which will be the biggest part of their tax cut. They do get a small tax cut that's permanent, but it's tiny in comparison. As I said, it's only about 4% of the benefit. Whereas most of it comes through in the Lamito, which is low and middle income tax offset, which is basically a tax refund at the end of the year. And the other problem you've got to remember is that from ABS stats, we know that the average savings rate has gone from 6% in the March quarter to 20% in the June quarter. So, and that's not surprising as economists, when you're worried, people tend to save. They tend to pay down debt. They're worried they're going to lose their job. If they lose
that
their
makes
job,
sense.
what are the chances of getting another job right now when everybody else is losing their job and unemployment's so high? So they save it all. The problem is stimulus saved is stimulus wasted. It doesn't generate anything if it's saved or used to pay down debt. And also, that's the average savings rate. So low-income earners don't save. We know that in normal times, the top 20% usually save about a quarter of their income. Now, the savings rates have quadrupled. So, and most of this tax cut goes to those top 20%. So, how many jobs it creates? Well, Treasury has some rosy figures about 50,000, but I highly doubt that we're going to see anything like that.
Can I add, Ebony? Yeah. Because there's a relationship between the tax cuts and the big 30 billion tax offset for businesses too. And we're talking about growing inequality. And not only will those tax cuts benefit the top income earners, which are more likely to hold assets and run businesses, who's actually poised to capitalise on a 100% tax write-off for new capital? Because actually leading into the crisis, businesses weren't investing, they weren't spending, and that's part of why this story of we had a strong economy coming into this crisis is false. What we had was actually increasing profit share of a small number of businesses who weren't investing, and they didn't have to invest because we kept giving them subsidies and handouts without any conditions attached to them. And that's what good policy would do. Would be, if you're going to provide, some giant concession, you should say, hey, provide some decent jobs for people here, invest long term in this economy. But we don't. The Australian government doesn't do that. So all that happens,
handing it out.
It's handed out, and a small number of businesses. And we should be upfront. The only sector that's going to benefit the most from this write-off is mining, because they've got all projects lined up to invest right now. And they're going to be able to write off all that capital-intensive initial construction, infrastructure of the sites. So it's pretty much a direct handout to that sector. But it's just the asset write-off and the tax cuts work together to compound inequality. And then you factor in the fact we've cut the coronavirus supplement for the most needy. So it's less jobs, more poverty, and more desperation and destitution, and higher inequality. That's how these things will fit together.
And just to highlight how perverse these tax cuts actually are, people on low and middle incomes will actually pay more tax next financial year than they will this year, because the LMITO will be removed. So they're going to pay more tax next year than this year, whereas high income earners get to keep their permanent tax cuts.
Thanks, Matt. Alison, I'll come back to you. You touched on those massive tax incentives and write-offs there for business, but I wanted to ask you about some other targeted measures that seem to be aimed at business, which is the JobMaker and Job Trainer, and I'm really sick of these names that just have job and a verb attached to it.
There will be a new JobMaker hiring credit to encourage businesses to hire young Australians.
But
it's marketing.
Yeah, which is the Prime Minister's background. But can you unpack the details of those two programs from this budget?
Yeah, well, to start off with, JobMaker has just been this blobby beast that anything that gets that government wants to say is about creating jobs, they just throw it under the JobMaker banner. So from the budget, we now know that JobMaker includes the income tax cuts. So it's just they've just thrown everything under the banner of JobMaker. But the major jobs creation program that they've hung their hat on is a credit to employers who employ young unemployed people on JobSeeker. And there are two rates. There is one rate for people between 16 and 30 years old, and it's paid to employers of $200 a fortnight, I believe. It could be a week, I should check that. Or $100 a week for people over 30 years old. And I think they must work up to 20 hours a week. So this program is supposedly going to cover 450,000 young people. And, there are huge questions and huge problems with this because it's not clear if it's going to be administered within the welfare system and therefore not be extended basic labour rights to the ability to be paid the right wage, to collectively bargain, to improve your wage, to be extended work health safety requirements, or if it's going to happen, in the welfare system. So there's some key issues with this program is it only runs for 12 months, the subsidy. So what I think will happen is that employers will take on these public subsidised, cheaper workers, sack them after 1 year because that's when the subsidy ends. And they will either use the program in those kind of low skill, low wage sectors, particularly places like agriculture. And we've seen the fruit growers all through the news saying we've got this shortage of labour supply, which of course they could raise their wages and provide incentives for people to travel out to the regions. But these sorts of programs I see fitting in with like the undersupply of cheap migrant labour, as well as the possibility that the program actually leads to employers sacking existing workers and replacing them with these cheaper, state-supported ones. So this is, I've huge alarm bells are ringing on this 450,000 jobs program, especially because it's been pitched as the answer to the youth jobs crisis, which is offensive. The other major component of this program is the 100,000 apprenticeships. This is under Job Trainer, 100,000 apprenticeships that will be funded. 50% of their wage will be funded by government to employers, and that's 100,000 in addition to the 180,000 they extended the subsidy to in March. Again, I call BS on this because actually from 2012 to before the crisis, we lost 200,000 apprentices and traineeships in our skills pipeline. And that's a lot to do with the defunding of TAFE, which is the main provider of apprenticeships, as well as the fact there's no work for these people to do. So I think that this 100,000 apprenticeships call is also going to be it's a furphy. I think these people need somewhere to study. There's no funding for the TAFE system, so they actually have somewhere to do their formal studies, and there's not necessarily clearly any work for them to do long term because government hasn't committed to those long term sustained investments, either in infrastructure or in our social infrastructure that would allow employers to take that risk and invest in recruiting someone and training them long term. So it's what's the elephant in the room here is that what we needed proportionate to this crisis was direct job creation from government in the public sector. And they are at pains to convince us that only the private sector can do this. And these two programs, I think, really reflect the weakness of that perspective and how short it's going to fall in meeting our jobs crisis.
Together, what we have announced since the start of this crisis, measures in this budget will see $14 billion in new and accelerated infrastructure projects support a further 40,000 jobs.
Matt, I'll come back to you quickly on infrastructure. I know the government has been talking a lot about the fact that there's nothing really kind of permanent in here and using that as a critique of Labor's stimulus spending during the global financial crisis. Can you just take us through how that compares and bring it back to that point that you made right at the beginning around what are some of the lasting benefits that we're going to see out of this budget?
Yeah, look, if there was anything that the government was trumpeting more than jobs, it was about infrastructure. And I think we've never seen a bigger molehill and a smaller mountain when the budget papers came out. There's actually $10 billion for infrastructure, which might sound like a large number. That's $10 billion over 10 years. Now, compare that to $30 billion over 4 years to business, almost $20 billion in tax cuts over 4 years, and $1 billion a year is pretty tiny. It's actually quite small, and it's kind of weird the way the government has trumpeted it so much. And you've got to also remember that this government has a real habit of making big infrastructure announcements that then go nowhere. Like we don't see anything. So, this $1 billion a year is probably not going to be $1 billion each year, but rather lots or most of it in the outer years. And so really this infrastructure spending is going to be quite small. But one thing to really note is particularly the Treasurer has been going around and saying, look, all of our spending is temporary. So, the reason you want to have temporary stimulus spending is that when the crisis is finally over, when the stimulus has worked and reinflated the economy and created jobs, you want it to kind of vanish. And one of their critiques is that the Labor Party's spending wasn't temporary, that it was permanent. But the problem is that's not true at all. So if you think about the Labor Party's, or the Labor government, I should say, stimulus spending, it was things like school halls. It was things like insulation. All of those are finished now. There was almost nothing in the Labor government's stimulus that lasted even till the 2013 election when the federal government, the current coalition government came to power. So it's simply not true. This government, you're right, most of it is temporary, apart from these huge tax cuts. But most of it is temporary, but then so was the Labor government's stimulus spending. It was also temporary.
Alison, I'm going to come back to you to dig a little bit deeper into women and young people. Now, there's a big fanfare about another women's economic security statement or something along those lines, but you mentioned right at the top that there's not really a huge amount in there for women, that practically speaking. Can you just take us through a little bit of that detail there, given that women have really borne the brunt of the effects of this recession, particularly in the first few months?
Yeah, well, when we had the shutdowns, women were most likely to lose their jobs because they were in those customer-facing sectors. Then we had this explosion in the caring burden, where women took on a disproportionate share of more care for children, for the elderly, more household tasks. And also because women came into this crisis making up a higher proportion of insecure workers, which means that they're cheaper to sack, basically, when a crisis hits for employers. All of these factors came together to create this perfect storm for women and their access to paid work. Of course, the free childcare policy from government lifted some of the pressure on households and allowed children to access important early childhood education. But then they pulled the rug out from that policy, like so soon after they'd thrown that lifeboat. So that was a big game changer because it pretty much entrenched all of the labour market fallout of the start of that crisis and entrenched the reality that women were not going to have an easy road back into the workplace. And that's what's missing. I mean, government really, there was a lot of pressure on them to respond to the disproportionate gendered impacts of the crisis. And that's why they said we're going to reintroduce this women's economic statement, which is historically something released alongside budgets that's supposed to outline a comprehensive plan for removing barriers for women to access paid work, improving their overall quality of life, participation in policy making. And it was just the most piss-weak document, and it was almost comically short on detail. I think any woman that was, or anyone that was following the gender story, would have just been scrolling and trying to look for more information. But it was
exactly
really
what I did last night. The Treasurer mentioned it in his speech, and there was no detail in that. So then I Googled the actual thing and tried to look through, and there was nothing.
Yeah, exactly. 240 million. Supposedly to repair all of that damage done, which, as I outlined, clearly very structural problems. The Australian Institute and the Centre for Future Work have done heaps of research on childcare, which shows that the system easily pays for itself if you let women back into the workforce. They earn more, they pay taxes, it pays for the system. Government could have brought that sort of thing forward. It's clearly the most demonstrated, benefit for women to get back into work. But instead we have just sort of tokenistic, 50 million for a women's leadership program, about raising awareness about women's, getting more women into male-dominated occupations. Presumably because they've given no money to female-dominated occupations and public services and childcare and, aged care, or even healthcare system in the middle of a pandemic. They've trumpeted infrastructure, and the route for women out of this is to put on a hard hat and learn how to,
build a dam.
build the dams, because that's where the money's going. So yeah, it's there's no direct job creation measure they've put forward. The closest thing to that is a 500-person cadetship to support women into STEM fields. And that's like an advanced apprenticeship that from their studies through to their placement in work. 500. I mean, there are millions of young women who need work right now. So it's, offensive is the raw, unfiltered version. But my economist explanation is that it will fall very short of increasing women's workforce participation and repairing their incomes. And really, it marks a return to traditional gender roles. I think a lot of feminists are concerned we're looking at the erosion of decades of progress to paid work.
And also, we know from the existing gender pay gap and from women not participating in the workforce as much, that has huge knock-on effects in terms of superannuation, because women obviously accumulate less during their working lives. But if you can just talk to me briefly about the fact that, there's a huge cohort of women who have just given up looking for work. And if they're out of the workforce, they're not earning money. What's that look like down the track when women go to retire?
Yeah, too right. I think we kind of already see what this looks like, because the largest growing cohort at risk of homelessness is older women. And this is the structural inequalities in both our labour market and our retirement income system, exploding before our eyes, and is really concerning to see government take money away from homelessness services in this budget at a time where we clearly have a national housing crisis. So I looked at some of the data on superannuation early release, which we should cast our minds back. Government introduced this super early release scheme and basically forced very desperate people to fund their own survival in March. They brought that in over 2 weeks before JobSeeker and JobKeeper. So what we saw is over 1.3 million women actually raided their super accounts. Over, I think, 13 billion has been stripped out. 300,000 women have completely, stripped their entire accounts. And of most concern is one of the groups of women that took out the most money were aged between 40 and 55, which is sort of like the prime earning years before you retire. So I think, we already have the crisis with, older women who don't accumulate have these same opportunities to accumulate savings and superannuation savings. But now we can see the crisis coming. It's that next cohort of women who are approaching retirement who are going to, it shows very clearly that we need to plug all the holes in the superannuation system and tighten it. And of course, this is the opposite of government, what are they doing, because they've tried to strike a blow to the superannuation system through this whole crisis, because they've got an agenda and they're pursuing that.
Yeah, and it's worth just reminding people that currently, before the COVID crisis, women retired, I think, on average with about half the superannuation account balances of men. So it was already a pretty dire situation before the pandemic and the economic crisis have made it much, much worse. We're going to go now to questions from the audience, and clearly everyone is really motivated and engaged. We've got close to 1,000 people here on this webinar with us. So I really do appreciate you all tuning in and all of your great questions. We won't be able to get to all of them, but we'll give it a red hot go. So the first one, Matt, I might send to you. It's from Oscar Delaney. What will the budget mean for the climate crisis and emissions reduction?
Yeah, look, the budget could have meant so much for the climate crisis. I mean, even countries like the UK under Boris Johnson, the Conservative, is looking at powering all of the households in the UK with wind power as part of the stimulus package. But here, there's a tiny increase in ARENA funding, but there's very little else. And in fact, a lot of the tax incentives, while not specifically directed at the fossil fuel industry and in particular the mining industry, are going to benefit them the most. So we know that if you can write off investments, there are large mining companies that have got huge investments, and they're going to be able to take advantage of writing all of that off against their current profitable position, because we know that resource prices haven't really fallen at all. So they're going to be the biggest beneficiaries. So fossil fuel and mining are definitely huge beneficiaries out of this budget.
So it's a little bit like the income tax cuts, where it's a huge outlay of spending, but really poorly targeted to those who need it least.
That's exactly right. And remember, the mining companies would have been making these investments anyway. So this is an additional investment. This isn't going to create more jobs. This is just basically handing them back money, allowing them not to pay any tax, not that they pay a great deal of tax anyway, but making it easier for them to pay no tax at all, under the guise of stimulus spending. But as far as money for renewable energy, as far as for decarbonising the economy, there's almost nothing in it at all. And the amounts are piddly in comparison.
That brings me to the next question from Andrew Swift, which was, why was the Australia Institute excluded from the budget lockup? To Matt's point, we weren't the only ones excluded. I think all environment groups were excluded from the budget, as well as a range of other non-government organisations. I noticed, I think Deloitte's got in there and a few other outfits like that. But due to COVID restrictions, there was fewer people allowed into the lockup, and the Australia Institute was amongst many organisations that were deemed not worthy of inclusion. So that's the reason why we were excluded. But I just want to reiterate the point that we weren't alone in that. There are a huge number of non-government organisations who were excluded, and I think you can see from who was the motivations behind that. It is unfortunate, but having said that, if the environmental NGOs got in there, there wasn't a huge amount for climate and a few token things for the environment that will be good, but really not enough to meet the scale of the crisis that we're facing. Thanks for that question. Here's a question from Marie Wise. Isn't the best way to grow the economy long-term to invest in technology, education, research and development, all of which in turn will create jobs and stimulate spending? Why do you think these haven't been targeted? Alison, I might ask you to answer that one. And can you take us a little bit to some of the announcements around manufacturing?
Yeah, I think manufacturing is a good place because it is the most research and development intensive and innovation intensive sectors of the economy. It's been in freefall in Australia, since for the last few decades, and a big part of the government's branding, industry branding of this budget was about a rebuilding of the manufacturing sector. And you might remember that early on, as the crisis hit, and when the National COVID Commission was put together, a lot of the pretext of that was about rebuilding manufacturing, and then it became part of the gas-led recovery, and then it got more scooped up into an agenda. But actually, this announcement came before the budget, but it was just for 1.5 billion was given to manufacturing, for a sector that's had decreasing output, collapsing employment, a more limited range of products being produced. So 1.5 billion, again, is drop in the ocean. In fact, it's only less than half of 1% of its total output of the sector right now. So there's a small modernisation fund that government's put forward of 52.8 million, which would allow and encourage businesses in manufacturing to invest in research and development, to invest in new technologies. Nominally, that instant asset write-off that government's brought forward would allow firms to employ, to invest in more capital and more productive investing, in productive investments. But because there's no plan for manufacturing and there's no more holistic industry plan that would nurture the industry long term, the kind of thing we saw in the post-war recovery, it's fair to say that we're not going to see a turn back of the very stagnating levels of research and development happening in the Australian economy. In fact, under this government was the first time that we saw research and development spending across the private sector and public sector decline for the first time in our post-war history, which is terrifying for an economy that calls itself, forward-thinking, innovative, advanced. Really, we are declining and hollowing out, and it's a big part of the fact that the mining sector is just sucking all of the guts out of the middle part of our economy, which is manufacturing. So absolutely, investing in research, new technologies and education are key parts of giving us all of the building blocks to build a more productive, larger economy with more people and more jobs. It doesn't produce the jobs in itself. I mean, if we didn't take an axe to the university sector and we engaged in mass public research spending, tripled the size of the CSIRO, provided thousands of direct graduate roles for young scientists. These are all sorts of things that government could have done if it gave a shit, essentially, about investing in research and technology and the future of and the health of this economy. But I guess I'd say, looking at the manufacturing spend and what they've done to universities, it's pretty clear that they're not serious about any of that.
Yeah, and if I could just add, Ebony, like the university sector is a classic case. They wrote the rules of JobKeeper so universities couldn't get them. Universities have been sacking lots and lots of staff. They've just passed legislation, or that looks like they're going to pass legislation now that's going to massively increase the costs of humanities degrees.
I think cut funding for research.
Yeah, exactly right. So, they seem to have this ideological hatred of the university sector, and yet this is the place where we create ideas and it could be the long-term drivers for economic growth.
And Alison, correct me if I'm wrong, but manufacturing is really part of the reason why it's an economic powerhouse is not just because of its investment in R&D and innovation, but also because it provides a lot of jobs. I think even though it's lost a lot, it employs close to 1 million Australians, and they're traditionally well-paid jobs, permanent jobs, full-time jobs. Is that right?
Yeah, and that's in part because of the capital intensity of the sector. Because if you're running, a manufacturing outfit, it generally tends towards wanting to employ committed, high-skilled workers. So it's a more long-term thinking sector. You need to have businesses that are determined to be in it for the long run, because the capital layout is so big to get up all of your machines and your place at the workplace, the factory. So it lends itself towards a structure of full-time, better, secure jobs, because those employers don't want their workers to piss off elsewhere. They want to hold on to them. And it's a completely different sector and employment model to the one that Australia has been driving in this neoliberal period, because we packed up all our manufacturing and sent it away. In fact, we willed it away. This government said goodbye to the rest of our automobile manufacturing sector. And it's a completely different workplace relations and sector, innovation model compared to, advanced economies like the Nordic countries, which have really strong, healthy manufacturing sectors, great skill systems, and higher paying, secure jobs.
Matt, you did a bit of analysis looking at what would happen if we had invested in services industries like health, like education, or I'm guessing even the university sector, compared to the income tax cuts. And again, if we think about this budget, the real objective is to create jobs and reduce the unemployment rate. What did your analysis show?
Yeah, we crunched the numbers late last night, and instead of handing out income tax cuts, so instead of spending about $18 billion on income tax cuts, let's say instead they invested in universities, they invested in childcare, they invested in healthcare and aged care, industries that have either been hit hard by the pandemic or would be really useful during a pandemic. We found that even using the $50,000 job figure that the government's claiming these tax cuts will create, and I can't even get close to that figure, but we found that 160,000 more jobs would be created if we gave that money to employment-intensive industries directly. That is, the government directly spent in and invested in things like aged care, invested in universities, invested in childcare. Then you get so many more jobs, 160,000. And if we use our jobs figure, it's almost 200,000 more jobs. We would have got almost 200,000 more jobs if we invested in these sectors rather than handing them out in tax cuts. And that just highlights how awful tax cuts are at creating jobs and stimulating the economy.
Almost as if trickle-down economics has been a lie this whole time, Matt.
Almost as if.
The next question is from Michael. I'm going to really mispronounce your surname. I'm sorry. Michael Namira Dowjet. And he asks, this may be a newbie question, but what are the real practical consequences of a deficit? Is there any actual reason to be worried about this one? Matt, I might take this one to you first.
Yeah, look, the government chooses to pay for the deficit by issuing what are called bonds, which are basically IOUs. And the important thing to remember about bonds is firstly, they have a fixed term. So there's bonds can be as short as 3 months, a year, 3 years, all the way up to 30-year bonds. And currently, the interest rate that the government can get on a 30-year bond. So a 30-year bond means that this interest rate is fixed for 30 years. They borrow money at a fixed interest rate for 30 years. Is about 1%, about a single 1%. Now, if you think about over the next 30 years, the inflation rate, certainly over the last 30 years, the inflation rate averaged about 2.5%. That means that the money that we pay back in 30 years is actually worth less than the interest we paid on that money. So the amount where somebody's actually effectively paying the government to borrow money. And so because the interest rate is so fantastically low, because the government can lock in that interest rate for up to 30 years, simply put, the amount of interest that we have to pay on this debt is going to be very, very small. And that's only if the government chooses to fund it through bonds. The government could, if it wanted to, fund it by simply printing money. At the moment, the economy is incredibly depressed. We have a lot of excess capacity in the economy. So therefore, the government could, if it wanted to, inflate the economy that way.
And for anyone who's interested, Richard Dennis has written an article in the latest issue of The Monthly that goes into some of these issues in more detail. Again, that's Richard Dennis in this month's edition of The Monthly. You can check that out. The next question is from Tony Webb, and I think it's a good one. Can we have a discussion about the social equity aspects of the choice of stimulus via tax cuts compared to the direct cash payments via the ATO that Labor provided during the GFC? What are the economic principles behind that? Matt, I might start with you and we'll go to you after that, Alison.
Yeah, look, we know that one of the problems with handing out money to people as stimulus is that they have the option to save it. And during times that are scary, like during a recession, if you have the capacity to save, and high income earners have the capacity to save, then they tend to save a big chunk of it, so it doesn't get spent. But there are groups within the economy who don't have the choice to save. If you're on unemployment benefits, if you're on minimum wage, you probably spend almost all of your income just meeting the basic necessities of life, paying rent, paying for utilities, buying food. These are the things you spend your money on. So if you give money to them, they're highly unlikely to save any of it. And we know that when they doubled the unemployment benefits, there were lots of stories of people going to the dentist and getting work done, going to the doctor, doing things that they had been putting off because they simply didn't have the money. So low income earners, which is what the Labor government handed out a big chunk of its stimulus spending to, not all of it, but a big chunk of it, actually does get spent in the economy. Whereas handing it out to high income earners is far less effective because worried rich people save their money, poor people spend their money.
And both of those are entirely rational decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Alison, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, we already have evidence about what the coronavirus supplement has been spent on. And that was an immediate boost to the lowest income people, not just those that are unemployed, but the payment is given to, wider groups, people on youth allowance. But some groups were obviously left out, and that's a huge problem. But there is clear evidence that as soon as that supplement was introduced, as an income bracket, people earning $60,000 and below, as the shutdowns came down, they actually ended up carrying the bulk of consumer spending. So every income group above $60,000 tightened their belts and saved. And then we saw later on in the ABS stats a confirmation that's where the household saving rate increased to near 20%. But it was really clearly those people at the bottom who were spending. And of course, it's probably one of the crudest things that economists can do to always talk about, like the jobs and consumer spending stimulus from giving money to poor people. Like we should obviously be striving for a society which eradicates poverty, and it's very easy to do this. And I think in crisis, it's clear as day that how is it that we tolerated hundreds of thousands, millions of people in a place of insecurity and poverty? We have, poverty sponsorship programs where Australian middle class people can sponsor the lives of poor people. I mean, this is within Australia. It's one of the richest countries in the world. It's just phenomenal we do this. But crisis shows when we introduce these measures, particularly the coronavirus supplement, that it is like the most effective way to eradicate poverty quickly and restore dignity to people's lives. And the stats prove, as Matt said, what people spent it on were essentials. Essential spending just skyrocketed on medicines, doctor visits, fresh fruit and vegetables, and it changed the lives of many people. And it's a crime that it's been cut by $300, and it's already impacting those people's lives. So yes, it's important for the economy, important for stimulus, but it's also important for building the kind of inclusive, equal society and economy that we should all be striving towards.
It's important because it's the right thing to do. I think that would summarise that. But yeah, it is worth noting that people like groups like ACOS had done, I think, surveys of people surviving on that $40 a day that the unemployment benefit was before coronavirus, and heaps of people were skipping meals. They couldn't afford 3 meals a day on that, and potentially that's what we're looking at returning to. Certainly there was no indication in the budget that the government will be permanently raising the rate of JobSeeker. We've only got 10 minutes to go. Matt and Alison, is there any good things out of this budget that were welcome types of announcements that we'd like to highlight before we probably finish on a bleak note because it's 2020?
Look, as I said, one of the best things about this budget was, we finally have the coalition admitting that there is no debt and deficit disaster, and hopefully having presided over such large deficits, which were necessary during the economy right now, having presided over them and made those decisions, that going forward we can actually have a far more sensible economic debate rather than this scare tactics to try and stop Australians from being able to make choices about what we think we want more of and what we think the government are going to provide. Perhaps we can have a choice about what we really want. How much do we want a first-class health sector? Do we want a first-class education sector? Rather than having arguments about it's all unaffordable and we can't afford it and, you can't have it. I know it would be great to have these things, but you just can't have them. So one of the best things, out of this is that it was the coalition that this recession happened during, and that, that they've been forced to admit that their rhetoric for decades is just simply nonsense.
Alison?
Yeah, I agree with Matt. I think there is not much to be enthused about, and I've just seen from the chat, some people saying they're feeling pretty down about this situation. I think we're all in that position, and solidarity with you on those that low feeling. I agree with Matt that what we've seen is a really rabid level reached in the debt and deficit politics. I actually think deep down that Australians have known for some time that it was all a crock of shit, really. And they always knew that. They always know that when people are at the top, they pull the levers in their own interests. So for me, what I think I see some hope in is that the space for democratic debate and discussion about what kind of economy we want is opening up. The hard part is that it's getting bad and it might get worse before it gets better. But I think as Matt outlined, there's this possibility now that the debt and deficit stranglehold is loosened. Government recognises that, and they've had to open up their speeches by saying this had to be done and it's necessary. but they are still threatening austerity. I think we should keep that in mind. It's a space that's opened up, and I think, I diagnose the problems that we face in Australia economically and politically based on a lack of democratic participation of everyday people. And, maybe this will show as it gets worse that we'll learn to look to each other and to work together rather than, looking to those who are captured by a smaller and smaller subset of interests that don't work in the majority's favour. So I think those conclusions are going to be reached more and more in this time, and perhaps that's my hope.
Well, I might add my own to that, which is that I'm hoping that the fact that so many people have become unemployed through absolutely no fault of their own might end this idea that everyone who's unemployed is just lazy and trying to bludge, instead of the fact that the government and business aren't doing a good enough job at creating jobs, or good jobs that will help people make ends meet. And I think, the reality of seeing some of those big lines out the front of Centrelink right at the beginning of the pandemic really hit home for a lot of people, just how frightening that prospect of unemployment is, because I think we all understand how tough we have been on people who are unemployed for a very long time now. So just to wrap up, we've only got a couple of minutes. So if you can keep this to 2 minutes, I think I want to take us back to, again, what we need this budget to do in a recession. The question from, where is it? It was a good question. From Wayne McMillan: will this budget solve the problems of unemployment and underemployment? First to you, Alison.
No, government planning to increase unemployment. That's what they said in the mini budget when they cut the JobKeeper subsidy. They've actually forecasted for an increase in unemployment, and they had to be dragged kicking and screaming to the wage subsidy. And I think their plan was to expand the ranks of unemployment, probably to introduce the kind of JobMaker labour schemes that they've introduced in this budget to subsidise labour through the unemployment route. So in that sense, no, I think we're going to see unemployment increase. I think women have disproportionately lost full-time jobs. They're going to find it hard to get back into full-time work without real supports. The underemployment issue is going to entrench and become worse for sure. We already know that the majority of full-time jobs, a majority of jobs lost since March have been full-time, something like 76%. And there's been a jobs bonanza recovery since May that government is pointing to, something like 420,000 jobs added since May, and they are disproportionately part-time jobs. 89% of all those jobs that have come back from the crisis have been part-time. And what we know about part-time work is it's more likely to be insecure. It's more likely to provide insufficient hours because people want more work, and that's what underemployment is about. So it's going to be more insecure, more anxiety-ridden, lower pay, no security long-term or vision about what happens long-term. And also what we've seen is a worrying increase in self-employment, which, the LNP like to say is a marker of entrepreneurialism, but is quite blatantly survivalist, gig work for people. So these are what the labour market stats are already showing. I think that unemployment is going to be a long-term structural feature of our economy now for many years, and it's going to disproportionately impact youth and women. And underemployment is going to continue to increase until we can, introduce the kinds of labour market policies that drive the creation of good quality full-time jobs.
Just before I go to you, Matt, if anyone is interested in what the union movement thinks about these labour market, well, not about this budget, but we did do a webinar a little while back with Sally McManus from the ACTU, who talks about a lot of the impacts the pandemic has had on the labour market. So I'd encourage you to visit our website and find some of those older webinars that deal with some of these issues in more detail. But finally, coming back to you, Matt, unemployment, underemployment. I mean, we do know what has worked in previous recessions. What's your final assessment that you'd like to leave us with about how impactful this budget will be on those?
Yeah, look, while the debt doesn't matter, it is important to be efficient with the money we spend to get the most bang for our stimulus buck. And it's very, very clear that this is not happening in this budget. This is a very inefficient way of trying to get jobs, and far more employment could be created if we did it a different way. In fact, the only limitation with this kind of spending that the government has is their imagination, and what this budget shows is we have a government with no imagination.
Thank you so much to Matt and Alison for your time today, and thank you everyone who's joined us today and for all your great questions. As always, I'm really sorry that we can't make it through all of your questions, but we tried to take a range there and cover a range of topics. Obviously, we only really have read through the budget papers since 7:30 last night, so I'm sure there'll be more analysis from the Australia Institute that you can find on our website. Matt's crunched the numbers on the income tax cuts already. Those should be up on our website very shortly if they're not already. This has been a special episode of Follow the Money, and we're aiming to bring you shorter but more frequent episodes during the pandemic, so please stay tuned. You can check out our website at tai.org.au/webinars to register for future webinars. And don't forget, it's not too late to sign up for the Australia Institute's Economics Academy, where we unpack some of the basic principles of economics and help you sound really smart at your next dinner party. For the latest health information, you can check health.gov.au or listen to the ABC's excellent Coronacast podcast, which comes out daily. You can visit our website at tai.org.au for all our latest research and content, including Matt Grudnoff's analysis of the income tax cuts. We're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a _N_T. Matt Grudnoff is at Matt Grudnoff, that's GRUDNOFF, and Alison Pennington is at AK_Pennington. This episode was produced by Jennifer Macey, and our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum. Remember, stay 1.5 metres away, wear a mask if you can, keep washing those hands, pay your income taxes, and thanks for listening.